Remember when a movie set inside a real psychiatric hospital became one of the most powerful and genuinely unsettling films ever put on screen? Released in 1975 by United Artists, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest followed Randall McMurphy, played by Jack Nicholson, a recidivist criminal who fakes insanity to dodge a prison sentence and ends up going head-to-head with the cold, methodical authority of Nurse Ratched, played by Louise Fletcher. Now, keeping them company on the ward were a cast of patients that included none other than Danny DeVito, Christopher Lloyd, and Brad Dourif, two of whom were making their very first film, and none of whom fully understood what they were walking into. Today, we're going to count down 15 weird facts about One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest that you probably never knew. And stick around for number one, because this film did something at the Academy Awards that had only been done once in the previous 41 years. And the guy who turned it down 4 times had a front row seat to all of it. Now, before we get into it, hit that like button and subscribe. It helps YouTube put this in front of more classic film fans who'd want to see it. All right, let's head to the ward. Number 15, every major star in Hollywood said no to this film. Now, by the time that the project finally moved forward in the early 1970s, directors Hal Ashby and Milos Forman determined that Kirk Douglas was too old for the part. That decision strained the father-son relationship for years. The search for a new McMurphy then became one of the more embarrassing rejection streaks in Hollywood history. Gene Hackman, Ken Kesey's personal first choice and physically closer to the character described in the novel, passed. Marlon Brando, passed. Burt Reynolds, who Forman described as having, quote, cheap charisma, which in Forman's world was apparently a compliment, either turned it down or got passed over, depending on which account you believe. Reynolds later said that he knew the role had Oscar potential, but passed anyway, convinced that an American actor simply wouldn't win the award for it. He was wrong about that. And then you've got James Caan, who looked at the script 4 separate times and said no 4 separate times. His stated reason was that the story wasn't visual enough for him. And that sentence, it has not improved with age. With everyone else out of the way, Jack Nicholson stepped in and immediately caused a 6-month production delay due to his existing commitments. Michael Douglas later said that delay turned out to be a blessing because it gave the team the time to properly assemble the ensemble of patients around him. Sometimes things just work out. Number 14, Danny DeVito had an invisible co-star. Now, filming One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest inside a real psychiatric institution for 3 months, it could take a toll. And for Danny DeVito, the toll arrived in the form of an imaginary friend. The shoot kept DeVito 3,000 miles away from his future wife, Rhea Perlman, for the entire production. And the isolation, it eventually got to him. He started having nightly conversations with someone who wasn't there. Not as a character exercise, not as a method acting choice, just a man, alone, and far from home, talking to nobody. But the part that makes this distinctly a Cuckoo's Nest story is what happened next. DeVito became genuinely concerned that filming inside a mental institution while playing a patient with a fractured grip on reality might be doing something to his actual grip on reality. So he did what any reasonable person would do under the circumstances. He walked down the hall and asked the real psychiatrist running the real hospital to evaluate him. Dr. Brooks listened, considered the situation, and delivered his professional verdict. DeVito was fine, provided he understood that his companion wasn't actually real. DeVito confirmed that he did. Dr. Brooks did clear him, but the imaginary friend, he stayed through the rest of production. There's something deeply perfect about a man filming a movie about the thin line between sanity and institutional life, who then had to get a psychiatrist to confirm that he didn't cross it. Number 13, the Oscar-nominated score was built from a toolbox. Now, most composers that are handed a film about institutional oppression and psychological warfare would reach for a full orchestra. But Jack Nictsche, he reached for a saw. Not metaphorically, an actual saw, played with a bow and a musician named Robert Armstrong, producing a high ghostly tone that sounds like it's coming from somewhere that you would strongly prefer not to be. He paired it with crystal wine glasses, running fingers around the rims to generate that distinctive ringing resonance. The Academy nominated the whole thing for Best Original Score. Finding Armstrong in the first place was its own adventure. Nitzsche tracked him down because he was the only known musical saw player in the entire Bay Area. There wasn't a deep bench to choose from. Armstrong also, he couldn't read sheet music, which meant that Nitzsche had to sing, hum, or play melodies on piano, while Armstrong would just copy them on the spot, which is either a charming creative process or a genuinely exhausting way to record a film score, depending on your patience level. The saw anchors the opening and closing themes specifically, which is exactly where it needed to be. It's the first sound you hear walking into the ward and the last one that you carry out with you. The choice was deliberate. A conventional score would have told the audience how to feel. Nitzsche and Forman wanted something that the audience could sense, but not quite name. A bowed saw and some glassware. nominated at the Oscars. I tell you, the 1970s, they were something else. Number 12, Sweden refused to let this movie leave. Now, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest was a global success in 1975, but Sweden took its appreciation to a level that makes every other country look casually indifferent by comparison. The film opened in Swedish cinemas in early 1976 under the title Gökbet, and proceeded to simply, never leave. It kept running and running for 573 weeks. That's nearly 11 straight years, and it was finally pulled from the schedule in the winter of 1986 and 1987. That is still a record. Now, to put that into perspective, this film was still playing in Sweden when Top Gun came out. It was still playing when Ferris Bueller took his day off. A significant portion of Swedish population had either already seen it multiple times or were about to see it for the first time when the rest of the world had long since moved on. When Forman found out, his response was, "I'm absolutely thrilled by that. It's wonderful." Which is a very reasonable reaction to learning that an entire country collectively decided that your film was simply not finished yet. Number 11, the movie was almost dead in the mail for 13 years. Now, Kirk Douglas bought the rights to Ken Kesey's novel in 1962, before it was even published, with every intention of starring in it himself. He went to Broadway with it in 1963, playing McMurphy on stage, and became even more convinced that this was his movie. The plan was straightforward. The execution, it was a 13-year disaster caused entirely by a book that got lost in the mail. During a goodwill tour through the Eastern Bloc, a mission that originated with President Kennedy, Kirk met a young Czech director named Miloš Forman in Prague and was immediately impressed and promised to send him the novel. He followed through. Czechoslovakian customs confiscated it. A story built around one man rebelling against an institution designed to crush him, it was not literature that the regime was interested in circulating. Kirk assumed that Forman had received the book and never bothered to respond, which he found a bit rude. Forman assumed that Kirk was exactly the kind of Hollywood guy who made enthusiastic promises on foreign soil and then forgot them on the flight home. Now, both men moved on and didn't cross paths again for years. Now, by the early 1970s, Kirk had accepted that he was aging out of the role and handed the project to his son Michael, then building his own career on the streets of San Francisco. Michael and producer Saul Zaentz went looking for a director, and through his screenwriter Lawrence Hauben, independently landed on Miloš Forman, who had since escaped to the United States. Now, Michael had no idea that his father had already tried to send Forman this exact book a decade earlier. Now, when Forman received the novel from Michael's camp, he said yes immediately, calling it the most fascinating, intelligent piece of literature that he'd encountered. And shortly after, he ran into Kirk, who opened with, "You Czechs, you sons of bitches, I sent you that book 10 years ago, and you couldn't even have the courtesy to respond." And Forman told him that he thought the exact same thing about Kirk. They compared notes, and the customs confiscation finally came to light. Later, Forman explained why the material had grabbed him so completely. The Communist Party was my nurse Ratched, telling me what I could do and could not do, what I was or was not allowed to say, where I was and was not allowed to go. Now, of all the directors who could have made this film, they ended up with the one man on earth who hadn't just studied institutional oppression from the outside, he lived it. Number 10, the studio tried to talk McMurphy out of his own ending. Now, before One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest found its distributor, it nearly got rewritten into something unrecognizable. 20th Century Fox came to the table with interest and one condition. McMurphy had to live. The tragic ending was off the table. Fox wanted survival, and they were serious enough about it to make it the price of the deal. Producers Michael Douglas and Paul Zaentz looked at the condition and walked. The ending wasn't a stylistic preference that they were willing to negotiate. It was the entire argument of the film. McMurphy's fate is what the story is actually about. Pull that thread, and the whole thing unravels into something that's considerably safer and considerably less worth making. Walking away from Fox meant walking away from a major distributor with the project fully intact and nowhere to go. They had a finished vision, a director, and a film that ended in emotional wreckage, which is not the easiest thing to shop around Hollywood. United Artists was the last option on the list. They said yes, and they said it without demanding a rewrite. Fox's version of the film would have been fine, probably. It would have tested well, made its money, and been completely forgotten inside of a decade. United Artists, they took the film as it was, and what they got in return was one of the most debated final sequences in American cinema, still being argued about 50 years later. Number 9, the scene Forman didn't want almost sank the entire cast. Forman did not want the fishing trip in the movie. His entire vision for One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest was built around confinement. Taking the characters out onto open water felt to him like puncturing that tension at exactly the wrong moment and watching it drain out into the Pacific. Producer Saul Zaentz pushed back and made the case that the scene was the point, the one moment where these men could actually feel human again. Forman remained skeptical, eventually agreed, and then the shoot at Depot Bay, Oregon made everyone involved wish that he held his ground. The waters were rough, the entire cast got seasick, every single one of them, with the sole exception of Jack Nicholson, who was apparently impervious to conditions that were actively dismantling his co-stars. The seasickness solved one filmmaking problem entirely by accident. The pale, pain, deeply uncomfortable expressions on the actors' faces required no direction whatsoever. Forman simply kept filming people who were genuinely suffering on a small boat in rough water and called it authentic performance. The chaos had worked. It turned out that a liberation scene filmed under genuinely miserable conditions captured something that a comfortable soundstage simply couldn't manufacture. And one last thing to look for when you rewatch it. As the boat pulls back into the dock, there's a woman standing in the crowd of spectators that doesn't say a word. That's Anjelica Huston. She was dating Nicholson during production, and Forman quietly put her in the shot. No lines, no fanfare. She was just there. Number 8. Forman kept rolling whether the actors knew it or not. Now, Milos Forman's approach to directing One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest had one fundamental goal. He wanted behavior, not performance. So he kept the cameras rolling during long, unscripted group therapy sessions and didn't always tell the actors when official filming had started. Now, actors who thought that they were rehearsing were sometimes already being captured. Reactions that seemed too raw and unpolished to be deliberate were frequently the ones that Forman kept. One of the film's more recognizable shots, Louise Fletcher delivering that cold, fixed stare after McMurphy returns from electroshock therapy, didn't come from a scripted scene at all. Editor Sheldon Kahn spotted the moment buried in the dailies, Fletcher making a small sniff and glance while Forman was talking to her between setups. She wasn't performing. Kahn pulled it and cut it directly into the film. Ratched's most chilling look? It wasn't directed. It was just found. Now, on top of that, Forman refused to show the cast their daily footage, which pushed his relationship with Nicholson past the breaking point entirely. Nicholson stopped speaking to Forman altogether. For a significant stretch of the production, the only way that director and lead actor could communicate was through cinematographer Bill Butler, who relayed messages between them on set. That frustration, that restless uncertainty about whether a system was working the way it was supposed to, it went straight into McMurphy without anyone having to ask for it. Hey, quick pause. If you're enjoying this one, hit that like button and subscribe. And drop a comment below. Tell us the moment from this film that you've never fully gotten over. For me, it's the baseball scene. All right, who's ready for another dose? Number 7. Nurse Ratched was cast at the last possible second. Finding someone to play Nurse Ratched turned out to be one of the harder casting problems in the history of 1970s Hollywood. Not because nobody was talented enough, but because nobody wanted the job. Anne Bancroft passed. Angela Lansbury passed. Geraldine Page, Ellen Burstyn, Jane Fonda, Colleen Dewhurst, and Jean Moreau all looked at the character and walked away. The role was considered too cold, too cruel, and too aggressively anti-feminist for any of them to want their name attached to it. 7 major actresses, each of them more capable of doing it justice, and each of them completely uninterested in finding out. Meanwhile, Louise Fletcher had her own problems. Robert Altman had written the role of Linnea Reese in Nashville specifically for her, down to giving the character 2 deaf children because Fletcher's own parents were deaf. Then, Fletcher and her husband had a falling out with Altman, who gave the part to Lily Tomlin. Fletcher was suddenly without a film. Forman had spotted her in Thieves Like Us and wanted her for Ratched, so she went after it. Now, getting the role, however, was not so straightforward. She spent the better part of a year auditioning, 4 or 5 separate meetings, each one ending with Forman telling her that she still wasn't quite finding the character. She finally got confirmed on December 26th. Her agent told her she was expected at the Oregon State Hospital on January 4th, 9 days before principal photography began on January 13th. Fletcher later said, quote, "I didn't realize that lots of other women were turning it down. To think, what if somebody else had said yes? Someone else almost did. 7 of them, in fact." Number 6, Louise Fletcher made her castmates genuinely uncomfortable on purpose. While Jack Nicholson, Danny DeVito, and the rest of the cast playing patients were bonding between takes, Louise Fletcher was kept apart. Forman's direction was deliberate. He needed the cast to experience her as an authoritarian figure, not a colleague. Fletcher leaned into it completely. The discomfort and resentment you see on screen every time that Ratched enters a room was genuine, manufactured through weeks of calculated separation rather than scripted direction. Fletcher described the dynamic plainly. The vibe was that the other actors were having the greatest time in the world, and I was stuck in a vice. They're having fun, and I'm not. Offset, people who knew Fletcher well described her as warm and thoroughly unlike the character she was playing. That gap between the person and the performance was the entire point. She understood that the moment her castmates saw her as a friend, the dynamic that she was building would evaporate. The isolation eventually wore on her enough that she broke from it entirely, stripping off the stiff white nurse's uniform down to a slip-in bra in front of the stunned cast. She later said that she was frustrated about something in the moment, but couldn't even remember what it was. It was clearly necessary regardless. When filming Ratched, she left every castmate a parting gift, a topless photo of herself wearing nothing but the nurse's cap. Now, Fletcher later said that she finds the film too painful to watch, not because of her performance, but because of what it depicts. She can no longer watch things that are inhumane, and that it comes with age. Number 5. Nicholson showed up at 6 a.m. for a scene he wasn't even shooting yet. Before filming the electroshock therapy scene, Jack Nicholson showed up to the Oregon State Hospital at 6 in the morning to watch an actual electroconvulsive therapy session. He observed a real patient receive a shock, watched the convulsions, took in the full clinical reality of it, and then carried everything he witnessed directly into his performance. On the day of filming, he insisted on being fully strapped down. The restraints were real, the position was real, and the discomfort was entirely intentional. If McMurphy was going through it, Nicholson wanted the physical experience of going through it with him. The rumor that he was actually shocked during filming had circulated for decades and deserves a quick burial. There's no credible evidence that that actually happened. And in practical terms, intentionally running electricity through your lead actor in 1975 would have ended the production in a completely different way than anyone intended. But that level of immersion was contagious. Real patients observed scenes during filming and delivered direct corrections to the cast. The substance of it being essentially, that's not how it feels, coming from people who knew exactly how it felt. Actors including Danny DeVito and Christopher Lloyd adjusted their physical mannerisms based on that feedback in real time. After enough weeks of that kind of proximity, Nicholson admitted that he could no longer reliably tell who on set was an actor and who was an actual patient. Now, for a man who showed up at 6 in the morning to make sure the performance was grounded in reality, that was probably exactly the point. Number 4, Brad Dourif didn't act that breakdown. He had one. Brad Dourif didn't show up to One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest having simply read the script and found his character. He built Billy Bibbitt's stutter from the ground up with speech therapists. He studied the mechanics of it until he had the technical foundation, and then he took it somewhere considerably less comfortable. He went out into public with it. Busy places, crowded environments, people in a hurry with no patience for halting speech and nervous pauses. By the time cameras rolled, the anxiety that Billy carried was not something that Dourif was performing from the outside. Which brings everything to a point in the scene where Nurse Ratched discovers Billy with a woman and calmly reaches for the most devastating weapon available to her, the threat of telling his mother. It's a quiet, controlled moment that triggers Billy's complete psychological collapse, and it sets off the film's true climax. Dourif became so emotionally overwhelmed that the breakdown stopped being a scripted beat and became something considerably rawer and harder to categorize. The fear of judgment, the specific terror of disappointing someone who holds power over you. He had spent months building a direct line to all of it, and in that scene, it opened completely. Number 3, the man who wrote the book refused to watch the movie. Ken Kesey wrote the novel that became one of the most celebrated films in American cinema history. Then he filed a lawsuit over it and refused to watch it. He was so committed to the position that when he accidentally landed on it while channel surfing one night, he changed the station the moment he realized what it was. The disagreement was not about minor details or a couple changed scenes. It was structural. In the novel, the entire story runs through Chief Bromden's first-person narration, his paranoia, his hallucinations, his theory about a shadowy organization called the Combine that controls society from the inside out. Producers made the call that a schizophrenic first-person narration wasn't going to translate to the screen. They shifted to a grounded, objective perspective centered on McMurphy, which made the film more accessible and made Kesey absolutely furious. Zantz had actually approached Kesey directly to write his own screenplay, and Kesey delivered one, which was told strictly from Bromden's point of view, exactly as the novel had been. The producers rejected it and moved forward without him, which accelerated the legal dispute considerably. Kesey also had serious reservations about Jack Nicholson being cast as McMurphy, which he raised alongside everything else when the lawsuit was filed. The film swept the Academy Awards, became a cultural landmark, and is still studied in film schools 50 years later. Kesey never watched it. The man who built the foundation sat out the entire celebration. And on the one night he nearly did it, he made sure to correct that immediately. Number 2, the hospital's real superintendent had never acted a day in his life. Filming inside a real psychiatric institution meant that production had to work directly with the people who ran it. Oregon State Hospital Superintendent, Dr. Dean Brooks, didn't just approve the shoot, he agreed to appear in it as Dr. John Spivey, the psychiatrist who interviews McMurphy during intake. Dr. Brooks had zero acting experience. That turned out to be completely irrelevant because Forman, he wasn't looking for a performance. He was looking for authenticity. In the scene where Spivey reviews McMurphy's case file, Brooks was reading it for the first time when the cameras rolled. Every reaction, every pause, every slight shift in expression, that was entirely genuine and completely unscripted, which arguably makes him the most authentic performer in the entire film. You got a real psychiatrist reading a real intake report, reacting in real time, surrounded by professional actors that were trying to do the same thing through craft and preparation. Brooks also made patient involvement a formal condition of approving the shoot. 89 real patients were hired as paid extras and production assistants, and the full cast spent the production living on the actual wards rather than retreating to hotels between takes. Forman wanted immersion, not visits. Brooks made sure that's exactly what he got. Number 1. It did something only one other film in history had ever done. When One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest arrived at the 1976 Academy Awards, it didn't just win. It swept, taking home Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor, Best Actress, and Best Adapted Screenplay. All 5. The full table. That had only happened once before in the entire history of the Academy Awards, in 1935, when It Happened One Night pulled it off. No film had managed it in the 41 years between then and Cuckoo's Nest, and in the nearly 50 years since, only one film has done it again, The Silence of the Lambs in 1992. 3 films. That's the entire list. Consider what had to happen for that to occur. A project that every major star passed on, distributed by the last studio willing to take it without demanding a rewrite, directed by a Czech immigrant who didn't want a key scene in his own movie, starring an actress that was cast 9 days before filming began, shot inside a real psychiatric ward using real patients as extras. That's the production that produced one of the 3 most decorated films in Oscar history. The people who passed on it had to watch all of that happen from the outside. James Caan turned it down 4 times. The man who said it wasn't visual enough for film watched it sweep every major award the film industry hands out. That particular sentence has not improved with age. And at the Oscars that night, it aged spectacularly badly. And there you have it, guys. 15 weird and wild facts about One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Which one hit you the hardest? Which one surprised you the most? Well, subscribe and share this with a friend who still hasn't recovered from that ending. Until next time, this is Remember When.